America's pastor, evangelical icon, the Reverend Billy Graham, left us this week at the age of 99. His spokesman for over 3 decades, Larry Ross, and Graham's grandson join us to discuss his life and legacy. And Communist China continues to flex its muscles in the South China Sea. And can they be trusted to make a deal with the Vatican? Author and expert on Asian affairs, CHANG, joins us with analysis. And finally, the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office is speaking out once again on Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, with some rather pointed criticisms. We'll tell you what he said and bring you the best of my exclusive interview with Gerhard Cardinal Mueller. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. First of all, a personal message to each of you who sent me such supportive notes and emails and letters this week in response to certain threats made over the weekend. To all of you who tweeted out hashtag I'm with Raymond, I feel very appreciative, and you know how much I love you, and to feel that support and your love means the world to me. And in the immortal words of Stephen Sondheim, I'm still here. An important world over for you tonight. TULLIAN TCHIVIDJIAN, Larry Ross, CHANG, and Cardinal Gerhard Mueller are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email me at worldover@ewtn.com. Let's get right to it. Christians in the U.S. and around the world are mourning the death of one of the 20th century's greatest religious figures, the Reverend Billy Graham. Suffering from cancer, pneumonia, and other ailments, Graham died peacefully Wednesday at home in North Carolina. He was 99. Ordained a Southern Baptist in 1939, by the late 1940s, he joined the then emerging movement. It was called the New Evangelicalism. The fiery young pastor began making a name for himself in 1949 during a Christian revival in Los Angeles. For nights on end, he preached in a packed tent he dubbed the Canvas Cathedral. He drew thousands to his message of Christ and God's love.
I do not believe that any man can solve the problems of life without Jesus Christ.
Over the next decade, his huge crusades in England and New York catapulted him to international celebrity. Eventually, his ministry reached more than 185 countries and territories as he preached to millions. He counseled every U.S. president from Dwight Eisenhower to George W. Bush and became known as America's pastor. Politically, Graham spoke out against communism in his early years and gay marriage in his last years. After Nixon's Watergate scandal, he told evangelicals they should never be too closely aligned with any particular party or person. However, almost on his own, he raised the profile of Christian conservatives who would come to rival the voting blocs of Catholics and liberal Protestants. Graham turned his ministry over to his son, Franklin, in 1995, only making occasional public appearances afterward. Ruth, his beloved wife of 64 years, died in 2007. Graham was once asked, what was the secret to his preaching? He answered, the secret of my work is God. I would be nothing without him. Billy Graham's body will lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol. He's only the 4th private citizen to be so honored. Joining me now with his reflections on the late Billy Graham is a man who knew him very well indeed. He served as the media spokesman for Reverend Graham for 33 years. He's currently president of A. Larry Ross Communications. Please welcome Larry Ross, joining us tonight from Dallas, Texas. Larry, thank you for being here at this special time.
Thank you, Ray. It's good to talk with you again. We first met when you were covering the Passion of the Christ. And that, I think, really does sum up Mr. Graham's ministry of more than 60 years, 6 decades in public ministry. He had a real passion for lifting up the name of Jesus to the high and the low all around the world.
No, he certainly did. Now, you spent so much time with him privately, Larry. Give us a sense, amid all the tributes and the remembrances you're reading, What don't we know about Billy Graham that we should?
Well, people have asked me to sum up Billy Graham's life and ministry in one word. I can't do it. I have to use four, and that would be integrity, humility, authenticity, and then love. And really, there weren't two Billy Grahams. The one that you would see preaching on television or in a stadium is the same one you'd meet with one-on-one. He just considered himself a country boy called to preach. He had no idea, was just overwhelmed that God would call him to have the type of influence and impact he had. And it was just a privilege to have a front row seat on all God did through his faithfulness to the calling on his life all those years.
He was amazing. You know, I've gone back over the last day or two watching some of his sermons, and when you see him as a young man in the 50s, he is on fire. I mean, I read a Bob Dylan tribute where he says, you know, this was the original rock and roll, you know, with that mane of hair, and that they called him God's machine gun early on because he would, you know, rat-tat-tat across the crowd.
Oh, yeah.
But really an amazing force of nature. And then, of course, he became the elder statesman of evangelists and really the Protestant
Well, he
Pope.
did, and he did. That's true. You mentioned his energy and passion in the early years. You know, he started out in youth evangelism with Youth for Christ. And interestingly, at the very end of his ministry, the last 22 crusades, we held what was called a youth night. And 17 of those would set stadium attendance records. So to have an 86-year-old evangelist setting stadium attendance records on youth night, that's a man bites dog story. Pretty amazing.
That is amazing. He had an interesting relationship too, Larry, and for the Catholics tuning in, who are a sizable part of this audience, Billy Graham was really a trailblazer in finding cooperation and reaching out to Catholics. And at a time when Catholics and Protestants viewed each other with suspicion, he was friends with Fulton Sheen, Archbishop Sheen, later John Paul II.
Right.
But in the 50s, tell us about the altar calls. He would often coordinate with local churches, most of them Protestant, but some of them Catholic.
That's right. In fact, every crusade that Mr. Graham held, there were 417 of them, during which he preached to live audiences of 215 million people in 185 countries. And they were always church-based. And Mr. Graham would only hold a crusade where he was invited and would only accept that invitation when he was assured of a broad representation of all of the churches and denominations in a community. And, you know, in recent years, beginning probably in the early to mid-90s, that did include Catholic congregations.
Right.
And everyone who came forward, Mr. Graham would say it wasn't mass evangelism, it was personal evangelism on a mass scale. Because everyone who came forward was met personally by a trained counselor and referred to a local church and neighborhood Bible study for follow-up. But in the case of the Catholic Church, they were referred to the diocese, so that the diocese then could determine to which local parish they would be sent.
Amazing. I know he was very close to John Paul II, and they were sort of kindred spirits. There's that great story Billy Graham writes about in his biography where John Paul comes up to him and grabs him by the lapel, and he says, "Graham, we are brothers." And, you know, the two of them did have this kinship. Tell me about that relationship.
Well, they did have a personal friendship. They met together 3 times, usually when Mr. Graham was over in that part of the world. In fact, Mr. Graham, when John Paul II was elected Pope, Mr. Graham was on with David Hartman on Good Morning America, and Mr. Hartman did not know how to pronounce his name, Cardinal Wojtyła.
Right.
And Mr. Graham had just preached in the cathedral in Krakow the week before, was able to help him out with that. But, you know, there's a communications principle, Ray, that the largest number of people focused on the smallest point of agreement gives you your greatest impact. And I believe that beyond their friendship, the point of agreement between Mr. Graham and Pope John Paul II was a burden for souls and a heart for evangelism. And I think that knit their hearts together and added to their friendship. And similarly, I think many times churches would come together. If I were to say, what's Mr. Graham's legacy? I would say, I don't mean to discount all the millions of people that I believe will be in heaven because of his faithful preaching of the message of the gospel. But I believe that Mr. Graham brought unity, credibility, and visibility to the local church. And I think that's a big part of what he will be remembered for.
Larry, before I let you go, he was a spiritual counselor to every president from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. Why not President Obama?
Well, actually, Mr. Graham had a relationship with 12 presidents, beginning with Eisenhower, who was in office when he first came on the scene. Right. He spent more time with, President Truman,
right.
And spent more time with him after he got out of office. But with the exception of President Truman, Mr. Graham knew all these men long before they got into national office. And then, of course, when Mr. Obama came into office, Mr. Graham had already stepped down from public ministry. He never had an opportunity to meet him, but President-elect Obama, when he was campaigning, made sure that he kept in touch with Mr. Graham and went to visit him as well in his mountain home.
And Trump talks about listening to Graham, watching him, and being influenced by him as well. So it's an interesting lineage there.
In fact, the current president actually attended Mr. Graham's 95th birthday party with his wife before he actually was campaigning for his current position. And so they have a personal relationship as well.
Amazing. Larry Ross, thank you for being here, for your insight and your personal knowledge of Billy Graham. God rest his soul. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And for more insight into the life and legacy of Billy Graham, we're joined by his grandson from Fort Myers, Tullian Tchividjian. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me about the man you called Daddy Billy.
Yeah, he was by far the most humble man I've ever met. I've said this to many different people, but the humility that the public saw was the same humility that we as family saw behind the scenes, and it was genuine. He was a genuinely humble man, a man who had accomplished so much in his lifetime, and yet at the same time didn't think he was a big shot at all, and didn't carry himself like he was a big shot. So his humility stands out, of course. His faithfulness stands out. I mean, here was a guy who was offered so many different opportunities to do so many different kinds of things throughout his lifetime, and he stayed focused on what God had called him to do, and he never got distracted. He never got off course. And so the man, his integrity, I mean, 60 years of public life without any hint of any kind of scandal is miraculous in my opinion. So in the sense of his character, his integrity, his humility, his faithfulness, those are all things we saw. He was a devoted family man. He loved his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. He was just a remarkable figure in our family. But as much as important as he was as a man to us and to the world, really, I think it was his message that probably set him apart in ways that are otherworldly, in my opinion. He was absolutely devoted to saying one thing. And the one thing he was absolutely devoted to saying is that the essence of the Christian faith is not what we do for God, but what God in Christ has done for us. It's not our performance for God, but it's what God has accomplished for us in the person and work of his Son, Jesus Christ. And so that, to me, is what garnered so much respect, even from people of different faiths, because he had so much character and so much integrity in the way that he presented the timeless truth of the gospel.
Tullian, give me a sense of what sets him apart among the other evangelists of his day. Not only, you mentioned the simple message that he really carried through the entire 60-plus years of his ministry, but what was it that drew so many crowds and that distinguished him? There were televangelists, there were people who had tent revivals all over the world. Why did Billy Graham stand out?
Well, I mean, I think, when it came to just natural giftedness, he was remarkably charismatic, he was winsome, he was simple, he understood things at a profound level, but he was able to communicate those things very simply so that everyday people could understand what he was saying. He just had a lot of God-given gifts. But more than his natural gifts, which everybody could see, I think he would be the first to say that it was God's anointing on him. It wasn't so much that he was the smartest guy or the best speaker or the best preacher. He would often say, I'm just a country preacher from the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, from a dairy farm. So he didn't fancy himself as being the most gifted or the smartest or anything like that, but he really did recognize that God's hand was on him, that God had called him to preach the good news of Jesus to the whole world, and he never wavered off course. And so I think one of the things that sets him apart from lots of other preachers is just his absolute focus on the main thing. I mean, he just stuck to the main thing. He would tell me all the time, as I was growing into my preaching voice, he would tell me all the time, make a beeline for the cross, make a beeline for the cross, make a beeline for the cross. He always pointed away from himself and pointed to the person and work of Jesus.
Tullian, tell me and give me a sense of that last conversation you had with your grandfather, which you recount beautifully in a piece I read earlier. What was the content of that conversation? What do you remember of it?
What I remember mostly is just the time together. I would get with him and ask him all sorts of questions. You know, here is a guy who really, in so many ways, helped forge church history in the 20th century. And so as a theologian and seminarian myself at the time, I was so keenly interested in the people that he met and the way certain things and movements got started. But it was that last conversation where we didn't really talk so much about those things. He talked about the difficulty of getting old. He talked about how much he missed my grandmother, who died in June of 2007. He talked about how much he missed his friends, most of whom had died years ago, some of his closest friends. But then almost immediately he shifted the conversation away from himself and started asking me questions. How are your kids? How's Gabe? How's Nate? How's Jenna? How's your ministry going? What are the unique challenges and opportunities you're facing? What are you preaching on? He was always... he wasn't always advising. I've heard a lot over the last few days about what an amazing advisor and counselor he was to world leaders, presidents, and other world leaders, and he was that. But at the same time, he was a perpetual learner. He asked more questions than he gave answers. He was always wanting to learn more. I was telling my wife earlier today a story about the time I went to visit him 3 days after September 11th, 2001, and George Bush had just called him, George W. Bush had just called him and asked him if he would come and speak at the memorial service at the National Cathedral. And I mean, literally, he had just gotten off the phone with him probably 5 minutes before I walked in the door. And so he was sitting there, and I said, well, Daddy Bill, it doesn't surprise me at all that they asked you to do that. You know, people have always called on you in a time of crisis, especially a national crisis or a world crisis, because you bring such words of perspective and peace. And I said, so what are you going to say? And he looked at me and he said, well, what would you say? And I was at the time, you know, I was 30-something years old, maybe, 28, 29 years old or something like that. And here he was sincerely and genuinely, he wasn't just patronizing me. I mean, he was sincerely and genuinely wanting to know, well, what would you say? He was always asking questions. He wanted to learn from everybody that he could learn from, even if it was someone, 50, 60 years younger than him, like his grandson, who didn't know half as much as he knew. So, I remember that last conversation, him asking me questions and wanting to know certain things. He would ask me Bible questions and theological questions. He knew that he was not a theologian or a scholar. He never fancied himself to be that. And so he surrounded himself with theologians and scholars because he wanted to learn, he wanted to grow, he wanted to develop. And so he was incredibly supportive of me, as he was all of his grandchildren and children, and just a doting grandfather and a remarkable father to my mother and her siblings. And we miss him already, and we know that we will see him again. But at this point, it's hard for us who have been left behind. But I think the thought that made me happy immediately after the shock of hearing that Daddy Bill had died yesterday morning, the thought that he had been reunited with Tete, which is what we called my grandmother, his wife of over 60 years, someone I know he missed terribly, made me very happy.
TULLIAN TCHIVIDJIAN, thank you so much for being with us, and our thoughts and prayers are with you and the family. Thank you for the memories. When we return, China continues to assert its dominance in the South China Sea as they finalize a deal with the Vatican. Asia affairs expert Gordon Chang will get into it all when the World Over continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over. Here's the latest China news buried by this week's debate over gun control in the aftermath of last week's Florida shooting. President Donald Trump will meet with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. He arrived in Washington on Wednesday and is meeting with top administration officials before meeting with Trump on Friday. Among the items at the top of their agenda, China, its regional dominance in the Pacific Rim, and as the Olympics come to an end, its role in the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Here with analysis on this and the proposed Vatican-China deal is attorney, Asian affairs expert, and author of the prescient Nuclear Showdown. North Korea takes on the world. Gordon Chang joins us from CPAC. Gordon, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much.
On Friday, President Trump will meet, as you heard, with Malcolm Turnbull, the Aussie PM, and they'll discuss China's continued expansionism in the South China Sea. Now, you believe, Gordon, that China not only wants to provoke confrontation in this contested area of water, it wants to pull the trigger. Why would it do that, and what does that mean?
Well, essentially, China wants to dominate the South China Sea and other peripheral waters. And what we're looking at is essentially what they've done in the past. When they've seen an opportunity to use force, they've done so. And so we cannot assume that they've changed their posture on this. And unfortunately, China has notions of its own size that are just incompatible because those notions conflict with surrounding nations and also with the United States, because we believe that the South China Sea and other waters are part of the global commons. And if the United States has had any consistent foreign policy over the course of centuries, it's been defense of freedom of navigation.
There has been international opposition to this, and in 2016 there was that ruling from The Hague which said there is no legal basis for China's claims over the sovereignty of these waters. How can the U.S. and other nations deter China from that continued expansionism of these seas? I mean, they've created literal fake islands, to try to mark their territory.
Well, the most important thing is to prevent China from taking over additional territory. And here, the flashpoint is Scarborough Shoal, which is about 124 nautical miles from the main Philippine island of Luzon, and it's not very near China. China seized it in early 2012, but they have not begun to reclaim it. And I believe that reclamation should be a bright line. This is something that the international community can't allow, because if we do that, then we're allowing them to make permanent an act of aggression.
Gordon, this week marks the end of the Winter Olympics in South Korea, where North and South Korean athletes were united. They presented as one group. Much attention has been paid to the region due to the Games, but also due to those tensions between the U.S. and North Korea after the missiles were fired late last year, those intercontinental ballistic missiles in late November, which caused such agita in the region. That promised meeting with Kim Jong-un's sister at the Olympics between Xi and Vice President Pence was shot down by the North Koreans, we now learn. A missed opportunity, in your opinion?
Well, not for us. What we did was we agreed to meet with Kim Yo-jong, the sister that you referred to, and we did that because we wanted to make sure that we maintained good relations with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who tried to arrange that meeting. And so we made concessions with that regard, because our position in the past had been, we're not going to talk to the North Koreans until they acknowledge that they have to disarm.
Right.
So this was really an issue of alliance management with Seoul.
Gordon, the Chinese are North Korea, let's face it. They smuggle goods in and out for them. They trade with them. They're their economic lifeline. Is it wise for the U.S. to continue to turn to China as a means of containing North Korean aggression, whether nuclear or otherwise?
Well, I think we should, but we need to start imposing real costs on China for those things that you mentioned, for supporting the North Koreans, for busting UN sanctions, and for other bad behavior like transferring components, equipment, and materials for their nuclear weapons program. We haven't done that. And until we do that, we're not going to get Beijing moving in a better direction.
This week, the Communist Party of China is marking the 170th anniversary of the first publication of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. At the 19th National Congress of the CPC in October, President Xi Jinping said that the culture of socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. In what direction is Xi taking China? It looks to me as if he's gathering powers to himself in unprecedented fashion.
Well, he demands absolute control over the party, and that the party have absolute control over society. He's closing China off to foreign companies. He's trying to grab territory from an arc of nations. He's trying to close off the global commons. He is actually trying to get rid of foreign culture in China, attacking Santa Claus and hip-hop music. This is just China moving in all the wrong directions across a broad front.
Yeah. No, he appears to be trying to establish a hegemon with himself at the center, sort of a second Mao. And that's peculiar, Gordon, given his biography. I mean, his father was a high-ranking official, was arrested, spent time in the law. Guy was murdered there, right? And he, or one of his sisters, rather, suicided as a result of this. Did you expect something different from Xi's reign?
No, and the reason is, Xi Jinping had been talking about certain things which people were ignoring. He had praised Mao and all the rest of it. Also, this is just the nature of China's communist system, that it was going to get to a point where someone was going to try to accumulate power after the years of his predecessor, Hu Jintao, who was generally considered to be the weakest of China's general secretaries. So this was foreseeable.
Wow. In the last several weeks, the Vatican has issued statements that they are close to a deal with China, which would include mutual recognition. The Chinese government would recognize dozens of underground bishops, and the Catholic Church would accept several bishops previously appointed by the government. Now, there's a curious wrinkle here. This is unprecedented, Gordon, from the Catholic perspective, where the government chooses bishop candidates and the Pope essentially has to rubber stamp them. And if he doesn't, there's a council, it has been reported, that could overrule him. Will this gain the Church any measure of freedom in China and those who are believers on the ground?
No, and we're seeing resistance not only from Catholics in China, but also Catholics everywhere, Cardinal Zen of Hong Kong, of course. I don't think that this is going to work out as Pope Francis thinks. And in a few years, we'll see that this was a debacle from the point of view of the Church.
In September, the Chinese government came out with those new regulations that were designed to curb and regulate religion in China. These new regulations, they went into effect on February 1st. We've reported on them in the past. And they call them 5 transformations of the Catholic Patriotic Association. That is the state-sanctioned version of the Church. Here they are: localizing religion, standardizing management, the control and appointment of bishops, indigenize theology, I guess to add communist thought to it, show financial transparency, and adapt Christian teaching as to mold them into institutions that reflect the objectives of the Communist Party. This reads like a move to restrict and further restrict already stringent rules on the practice of religion. Your take on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen developments since then also in that direction. It's clear the Communist Party thinks that it can control religion. It's going to try to do so. And unfortunately, it now seems to have an ally in the Vatican. I think that we're going to see a schism in the Catholic Church in China because people are not going to like this deal, and they probably are going to start their own Catholic church on a different level, away from the Communist Party.
Wow. Given the history of persecutions against members of the official and underground church, what do you see as the future of religious and religious people in China? Not only in light of these rules, but given what you know about the way this regime deals with any group that's a challenge to its authority.
Believers are going to win. They won in the Soviet Union. They've won elsewhere. China's Communist Party is really afraid of religion. And it should be, because religion is winning and the Communist Party is retreating. Yeah, the party can be coercive. It can win short-term victories. Long-term, it doesn't have a chance.
A historian and theologian in the United States, an Italian one, Massimo Fagioli is his name. He tweeted something out the other day. I want to share this with you and get your response. He says, for the social and political tradition of Roman Catholicism, it is relatively easier to talk with the government of the People's Republic of China than with the NRA and Second Amendment Catholics in the United States. Your reaction to that idea?
Yeah, I don't agree. You know, this is obviously very political from a domestic point of view. But, you know, I believe that, that I just can't accept those statements.
Well, give me your thoughts, Gordon, on the Vatican's optimistic view of China and being able to make a deal with the People's Republic of China. Is that a good piece of calculus, given what we know about the regime and the way it has rarely kept its word in the past?
Yeah, any deal with the Communist Party is going to backfire for the church. I think the best thing to do is just allow general trends to continue, because believers are going to win in China. There's no sense capitulating to the Communist Party. That's only going to break up Catholic believers in China and put them into different groups.
No doubt they fear Catholic believers and Protestants as well, because you have a unified group of people who, if you look at other countries where the communists moved in, this was the beginning of the end for them, when you had fervent believers in the center of those communities and those nations. The Chinese have to be very attentive to that.
Absolutely. Religion is growing so fast in China, the Communist Party can't contain it. Just to give you an example, you know, we go to church for maybe an hour, hour and a half. In China, in the underground churches, they go to church all day and still feel it's not enough.
Wow.
The Communist Party hasn't seen fervor like that since 1949.
And the Catholic Church estimates that they had 50,000 baptisms last year. So as you said, it is catching, it is moving like wildfire. And given the challenges and the great persecutions these people endure to practice their faith, it's amazing that we see that. Gordon Chang, thank you as always. And you can visit Gordon at gordonchang.com for the latest on China, North Korea, and much more. Thank you, Gordon. When we return, is there a paradigm shift in the church regarding divorce and remarriage and communion? A high-ranking cardinal this week says absolutely not. We'll bring you that story when The World Over continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. Illinois Bishop Thomas Paprocki affirmed this past week that Democrat Senator Dick Durbin is not to receive Holy Communion. In a statement released by the Diocese of Springfield, Paprocki said Durbin's voting record in support of abortion over many years constitutes obstinate persistence in manifest grave sin, a reference to the Church Code of Canon Law 915. The bishop pointed out most recently that Durbin was among 14 Catholic senators who voted against the bill that would have prohibited abortions after 20 weeks of gestation. Paprocki is the only U.S. bishop to have publicly called out a senator in his diocese for the vote by invoking Canon 915. He said it is not his intention to, quote, punish Durbin, but to bring about a change of heart. He was once pro-life, the bishop said. I sincerely pray that he will repent and return to being pro-life. And LifeSite News reports that it has obtained internal documents from the U.S.-based Papal Foundation, showing that Pope Francis asked for and partially obtained a $25 million grant to a church-owned and scandal-plagued hospital in Rome. The unusually large sum raised red flags for members of the foundation. It normally issues grants of no more than $200,000. The Papal Foundation's board is made up of donors as well as U.S. bishops, including every U.S.-based cardinal, and it exists to fund initiatives for the poor. Now, the documents show that the Pope's original request was made through Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Donald Wuerl. On January 6th, the chairman of the Foundation's audit committee resigned in protest of the grant. So did two other members. The former chairman was uncomfortable with the grant being awarded to a facility with, quote, a history of mismanagement, criminal indictments, and bankruptcy. We are told that the bishops refused to answer questions about the Roman hospital. A document dated January 8th quotes Cardinal Mueller, suggesting that the grant was made, quote, in the larger context of the Holy Father's commitment to confront corruption and financial mismanagement both within the Vatican itself and in outside projects. The hospital in question is accused of money laundering and is in the hole to the tune of $1 billion. We'll keep following this story. And it's becoming a clash of cardinals over the heart of Catholic teaching. Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, is rejecting the idea from other prominent cardinals in the Church that we are in the midst of a paradigm shift or entering a new paradigm in the Church's approach to its teachings. Instead, Mueller insists that the Church teaching has continuity and that the term paradigm shift seems to be a relapse into a modernist and subjectivist way of interpreting the Catholic faith. It all started last month when paradigm shift became the new buzzword surrounding the controversy over Pope Francis's teaching on the family, as expressed in his exhortation Amoris Laetitia. Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin said the Pope was calling the faithful to a, quote, paradigm change, a new spirit, a new approach. Amoris Laetitia, he continued, is a new paradigm that Pope Francis is carrying forward with wisdom, with prudence, and patience. Echoing that sentiment, Chicago Cardinal Blaise Cupich said earlier this month that Amoris Laetitia is a major shift in our ministerial approach that is nothing short of revolutionary. This represents an enormous change of approach, a paradigm shift, holistically rooted in Scripture, tradition, and human experience. In response, Cardinal Mueller published an essay in First Things this week. The title of the essay asks rhetorically, development or corruption? In it, he excoriates the notion of a shift in church doctrine, saying that it suggests a break from apostolic teaching, such as occurred with the Protestant Reformation. As such, Mueller argues against those who interpret Amoris Laetitia to effectively deny church teaching, namely, quote, that adultery is always a grave objective sin. He continued, when pastoral change becomes a term by which some express their agenda to sweep aside the Church's teaching as if doctrine were an obstacle to pastoral care, then speaking up in opposition is a duty of conscience. As the unresolved issue of communion for divorced and civilly remarried Catholics rages on, I thought I'd bring you the best moments on that subject from my exclusive interview with Cardinal Gerhard Mueller. I sat down with him at Christendom College when this story was just gaining traction, and the Cardinal's words and clarity still resonate. I want to start with your book, the Cardinal Mueller Report, which has a vague reference to your predecessors, the Cardinal Ratzinger Report of many years ago. It focuses on hope and the various dimensions of hope throughout the Church, the world, the family. Where is hope most lacking in your mind, and how do people miss it?
The title is not only a vague link, but is a directly wanted link, because he spoke about the report about the faith, and we have another theological virtue, which is a hope, very linked surely with the faith and the love, and we know and remember the big encyclica of Benedict about Deus Caritas, as God is love. And therefore in our time we think we need hope, to have orientation for this short time of our earthly life, but we are waiting a long life, the eternity, because we are created for the communion with God in love, and therefore we cannot restrict our existence only to the efforts in this world.
I want to move back into the ranks of the church here. Let's talk about Amoris Laetitia. This is an exhortation that has the result of 2 synods, which has garnered so much attention, and reams of paper and ink have been spilled about what Amoris Laetitia intends and what it means, particularly that 8th chapter. And in it, the Pope seems to be suggesting, and some have suggested, even in bishops' conferences around the world, that a divorced and civilly remarried Catholic may, with the accompaniment of their pastor, without an annulment, receive the sacraments and be welcomed into the sacraments, despite the fact that in time gone by this would have been considered living in sin. Your thoughts? Is that possible? Is that what's being advanced?
The Pope at the beginning or before the 2 synods, he spoke often from the rehabilitation of the Catholic understanding of marriage only and exclusively with one man and one woman, because that is the will of God. The main reason of the 2 synods and then the result in Amoris Laetitia is to underline the importance of the marriage and the families and the marriage, especially the marriage between baptized persons as the sacrament. This is absolutely impossible that the Pope, as a successor of St. Peter and the vicar of Jesus Christ for the universal church, presents a doctrine which is plainly against the words of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a relator, the Pope and the Magistery as only the interpreter, and therefore the doctrine, according to the indissolubility of the matrimony, of the sacramental matrimony, is absolutely clear. The approach of the Holy Father is to help and to have in his sight, in his eyes, all these people who are living in the secularized society, have not a full understanding what is Christian life and thinking. And he doesn't want to say, or either you accept all from the beginning or you are absolutely out. His thinking is all these people who are not so linked with the church and have some difficulties, we must lead them as good pastors until this point that they could accept completely the Christian doctrine and Christian life and our understanding. And the famous footnote where it said, yeah, in some cases there is possible the access to the sacraments of the penitence and the Holy Communion. What is a sacrament of penitence? In the case of a mortal sin against the 10 Commandments or other commandments of God, or the will of God against the love, you need first the conversion, the inner conversion of the heart. Penitence, you must have the clear will to not sin in the next opportunity. And in this case, if they are ready to live as sisters and brothers, there could be in some cases possible, but it's not possible to live with 2 legal wife, with one is sacramentally married, with the other only civilly. It is not possible because we don't accept polygamy.
So it's
that is not possible now.
Just to be clear, many are interpreting this and have as a not doctrinal but pastoral end around annulments. So by being pastorally open to these people, you can somehow avoid annulments and still get to the sacrament with your civilly married wife or husband.
I criticized all the time this thinking or this opposition to let the doctrine as it is and to surpass it with a pastoral is not Catholic thinking, because for us dogmatic and pastoral is the same thing.
It's one, but the practice is the belief.
Is the belief, no? Because it would be, this interpretation would be a certain revelation of a Christological heresy. Christ as a word of God, the doctrine of the church, and Christ as the good pastor is the same person. You cannot separate or distinguish between Jesus Christ as a teacher of the word and the good pastor who gave his life. And some of those people who present themselves as a counselor of the popes is that in the theology, in the pastoral, 2 and 4 can be 5. That is not possible because we have the theology. No?
Given all of that, Your Eminence, given all that you've said, which rightfully is within a doctrinal as well as a historical context, does it trouble you that so many bishops' conferences are at odds in their interpretation of Amoris Laetitia? Your German confreres are saying, you may come to communion without an annulment. You have the Maltese bishops saying similar things. And then the Canadians and the Americans are going in a different direction. Does this feel like a Protestant Catholicism to you?
No, it is not good that the Bishops' Conference are making official interpretation of the Pope. That is not Catholic. We have this document of the Pope and must be read in the context of the complete Catholic tradition. We don't have 2 magisteries, one of the Pope, another one of the bishops. I think this is a misunderstanding, a bad misunderstanding who could make damage for the Catholic Church.
Why do you think Amoris Laetitia has been so... It was a document intended, I think, to bring everyone together around the centrality of marriage and family. And yet it has caused such global division. I mean, even the Pope himself, when he approves of the Argentinian bishop's interpretation, that seems to give credence and weight to the absolute opposite of what the interpretation you're advancing, that you can't change this and that nothing has changed and that there is no possibility of this. The Pope seems to be giving a preference to the Argentinians who say there is a path here.
I'm not so glad with all these actions. The bishops interpret the Pope interpret the bishops, and we have some rules how to act in the church. We have the synods coming together, and then the Pope makes a summary, and with his papal authority he gives the explanations or writes the documents, and then must all be finished, not interpretation of the interpretation. That is not good for the church. I am saying as a Catholic theologian.
What do you make of that dubia that those 5 cardinals submitted? Should the Pope answer that dubia just to put this to rest, to once and for all use his papal authority to silence all of these voices and different interpretations? Is it time to do that, in your opinion?
No, the one thing is the content of this dubia, the legitimate questions to the Pope. The other point is that this came out and was a public discussion and tensions between Pope and some cardinals. That is not good in our world of the mass media. Our enemies are glad of the church, to see the church in a certain confusion as prefect. That dogmatically and doctrinally, Amoris Laetitia is very well, and the misunderstandings of the both sides has to do with ideological view of things and prejudices, no? And some entered the synod with their understanding we must fight for our ideas, and they had argued too ideologically. We must have also the responsibility for the unity of the church, and it's not good to make a pressure only, or to enter as a pressure group for own ideas in the synod. And there's a problem the church have in the world of today, that we have two wings, ideological wings, extremes, and everybody want to win the battle against another one. On behalf of one, revelation is coming from God, and the revelation, the word of God, unifies the believers, and it is not our task to unify in a totalitarian way. Everybody must think like me, because the thinking of another person is not important for my salvation. Only the word of God can unify the church and can save everybody.
That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week and set your DVRs. You don't want to miss this. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.